How many of you guys have heard about my book before, or books? Oh, Marcus, yay. My plant in the audience. One more? Oh, excellent. Two plants in the audience, excellent. All right, hold on a second. There we go, that's the whole talk. We're done, yay, we can go, no. One more second. One day I've got to upgrade to Keynote. And I can use this guy, in theory. Oh no, don't risk it. Don't risk it, all right, I'm not risking the remote.
We can try it for the first slide.
I know we're 3 minutes over. Oh, there we go. All right, excellent. Slideshow. All right, yay, here we are. Excellent. Well, thank you everybody for coming. I know you had other alternatives, so I appreciate you coming to see me. My name is Scott Rogers. We'll be talking about that in a second. You are at the Game Design Conference, and you're here to see everything I learned about level design. I learned it from Disneyland. So before we begin, real quick, this talk gets a little schizophrenic in the sense that I talk about guests, which is Disneyese for people that come and visit our wonderful experiences, and players, which in terms of looking at things relating to Disneyland, our guests are our players, if you want to boil it down. So just so you know, you don't have to wear the ears to play anything Disney related, but it doesn't hurt. All right, so who the heck am I? I'm Scott Rogers. I have designed games for a very long time, back in the old 16-bit dark days. And when I first started out, well, let me go end up where I am now. I worked for 19 years in traditional console games, so everything is kind of from a console game perspective. So if I'm offending any serious game makers or indie game or mobile gamers, just bear with me, it still applies. But now I work for Walt Disney Imagineering, and here's what I do for a living. I am a part-time pirate. As an Imagineer, I'm sorry, there are 3 things I cannot do for you. One is I can't get you free tickets. The second is I can't hear your ideas for your awesome new attraction, technically. And 3 is I can't get rid of that attraction you hate so much at our parks. So sorry about that. But what I can do is give you a disclaimer that my talk and the things I am saying are my personal opinions only and not that of the Walt Disney Corporation. So please keep that in mind. Don't sue me, bosses. Okay, here we go. So way back in 1996, when I was making console gaming or starting out as a game designer, I had no clue what I was doing. I had nowhere to start. There weren't schools, there weren't books, there weren't even blogs that I could go and learn how to make games. But what I did have was an inspiration, which was to be inspired by this. And this is a fun map created by a Disney Imagineer named Sam McKim. And Sam, who's an awesome artist, drew this really cool map, essentially a cross view of the Pirates of the Caribbean attraction. Now, how many of you guys have been to Disneyland? There we go. And so how many of you guys have been on Pirates of the Caribbean? All right, excellent attraction, one of our better ones. And so when I was looking at this fun view map that was in this guide that I got when I was a kid, I noticed that there were some similarities between the path of the guest through the attraction and the path that the player would take through a video game level. So for example, you can see this blue path is signifying the water, and you would pass by pirates kind of drowning this guy, and they're having there's wenches being bitted on there off the screen there, and there's fire, and there's pirates shooting at each other, and it kind of reminded me of the things that I would see in games, right? I would see characters shooting at the player, trying to kill them, and interesting environments and scenes, and so I said, you know what? The game I was working on at the time was Pac-Man World, and so I drew up my own version of what Pac-Man World Pirates of the Caribbean would be. And there's drunken ghost pirates, and they're shooting cannons at each other, and pirates with swords, and there's even a little small world thing that never got into the game. But essentially, it helped kind of free my mind up to think about games as this experience that is not only storytelling, but this sequence of mechanics or different experiences going on that the player would interact with. And so I said, I wonder what else between video game design and Disneyland are similar. So I started doing my research by going to Disneyland. And I found out, of course, Disneyland is named after this guy. Hey, boss. So who is this guy? Of course, he is Walt Disney, the fellow who created Disneyland. And Walt, when I started to read about the creation of Disneyland, and the steps that they took to get there, to come up with the ideas. Of course, Walt coming from animation and from filmmaking, story is king. And that's still true to this day at Walt Disney Imagineering, is we always need to know what is the story, right? And story is very important. Now, you just heard an excellent talk by Cynthia. Hopefully you sat through it about story and how to get it into games. Can you hear me? I'm still loud, though. It's going to reverb. Okay. All right. And so, of course, every story, as you know, has a beginning, a middle, and end, right? And what Walt Disney and the Imagineers would do is they'd have story sessions. So they would sit down and they'd say, all right, what is our story? And act out what the story of the attraction is and the experience that they want the people to have. Then they started talking about the themes. So what kind of experience do we want our guests to have, right? And Walt was a pretty moral guy, so one of the things that he was interested in was some sort of moral arc in the storytelling, and everything had to have at least a little bit of a lesson, right? And so when you watch the classic cartoons, I'm talking the features, so the Peter Pans and the Snow Whites and the Pinocchios, you start seeing these themes that are part of the story introduced into the attractions, because the attractions eventually were these replicas of what was going on the screen. So we'll talk a little bit more about things like moral arc. But what do we want the player to learn out of this? What do we want? What kind of emotion do we want them to feel? What do we want them to learn? Or what kind of activity do we want them to do, right? Because we're building a theme park world, and just like we're building a game, there's activities as well, things that you'll interact with and things that you'll do. Then pre-visualization is very important, because the Walt Disney Imagineers are all very artistic folk, and there's painters and sculptors, and so what the Imagineers would do is they would build models of their attractions before they would make them. They do concept art, of course, like we do in video games. And one of my favorite stories is how they built this scale model of the Pirates of the Caribbean attraction, and Walt would ride through on a wheeled chair to kind of see where things happened in perspective of the guests. So as the guest was going through, let's say, the burning city, Walt would sit in his chair and kind of go, okay, they can see what's the first view we get that's going to give us the maximum impact, and what kind of experiences are going to pass by, and what's going to grab their attention. And so even from this micro level, this little miniature, he was able to start being able to tell what the end experience was going to be like. Essentially, he was simulating a camera like we would in a video game, right? And then the other strategy that was really useful was starting from the top down. So Walt would think first about the world, and he would work his way down. So just like we do in video games, we go from the game world down to the level to the individual experience or interactions. Disneyland is built in the whole world down to a land and down to an attraction. An attraction is like the individual experience or the activities that the player is doing, right? And when Walt would always talk about Disneyland, he would always say, well, I don't quite know what's in it, but it's surrounded by a train, right? Because he loved trains growing up, and he had a scale model of a train in his backyard. And he knew that whatever he wanted to make had to have a train going around it. So he immediately set up a criteria for himself to limit himself down to say, no matter what we build, we still have to be able to have a train go around it. So it's actually a really good learning lesson to work with a little bit of limitations, right? So that way you're starting from a point saying, all right, well, it's not going to be, we're not building a whole country, we're not building a whole world, we're living within this, let's see what we can make. So when Walt and the Imagineers started thinking about, well, what is going to live into this land, Walt went with his interests. And so being obviously interested in things that aren't necessarily pertaining to the industry that you work in. So for example, even though Walt loved filmmaking, he loved history. And he loved futurism. He loved thinking about what the future is going to be like. And he had a great fondness for his hometown of Marceline, Missouri, and his childhood that he had where he was raised on a farm with all these animals. And so his story was, well, I want to reflect all these things that I'm interested in, and I want to get other people excited about them as well. And this is the true when you're thinking about your own game, right? We're all nerds to some capacity, and we all have swum in the same waters, right? We all love video games, and we all love Star Wars, and we all love comic books, but if we all made the same thing, based on these comics and video games and movies, we would just be playing the same game over and over again. And so the real innovation comes when you bring the things that you're personally interested in, right? This is the true life adventure stuff with Walt that gave us Adventureland, because he was interested in the natural world and all the interesting things to be found there. So the first thing, when you enter Disneyland, you are handed a map. And a map is very important because not only does it help you understand the whole scope of the world, but it starts giving you destinations. You can start thinking about, all right, well, what lives in this world, and where can I go, and what, how do I get there? And building a path, a clear path for the player, just like in Disneyland, it's very important in video games and in level design. And so at Disneyland, there are 3 types of paths. Well, actually, it's the world map. Sorry, jumped ahead. The world map, you know, as we know in video games, it's a very common trope, right? So as you look at it, you start wondering about the mysterious places. You go, oh, I wonder what's on that mysterious island with the diamonds or the little mountains around it, or what's going to happen here at those hills with the little eyes on it, or what are those strange, what's going on in that forest, right? So it starts piquing the player's curiosity. So another strategy that Disneyland uses that we can use in games are posters. And so once you get that map and you've looked at that map and say, all right, wow, there's a lot of choices here for me to choose from, I wonder, well, you know, let's see what the next thing brings, right? And so as you go through the tunnels that lead into Main Street, you see several attraction posters. And the attraction posters work like travel posters in the sense that they say, all right, you've looked at the map, there's a lot of options, you might not know which ones to pick, but here are some interesting things that you might want to do. You might want to fly a rocket in outer space, or you might want to ride a bobsled down a mountain, or you might want to experience the danger of being in Africa, or you might want to go to a place where there's ghosts, or giant octopus, or fly a pirate ship, or whatever, right? And they're treating, because they're treating them like travel posters. If any of you have seen kind of the old travel posters, particularly the ones that are from the, I want to say about the 30s, that got people interested in visiting all the natural wonders like Yosemite and the Grand Canyon and that, these posters are based on that style. And so as you look at these posters, you're like, wow, not only are these really a lot of diverse and cool things for me to do around Disneyland, but there's also things that might be a little dangerous, right, or a little thrilling. And so it starts piquing the player's interest and foreshadowing all these different things that they could experience along the way through the level or through the world. Now, in video games, there aren't too many uses of poster, but a really good one is in Bioshock, right? When you first show up in the underwater city, you see all these posters advertising all the different abilities that you can get, and they, you know, this one says, you know, my dad can throw lightning out of his hands, and this one allows me to shoot bees and things like that. And so you start looking at these posters, and even though you have no context of what these ultimately mean until later on in the game, you go, oh yeah, I remember the throwing lightning. That was like that poster I saw earlier. So the player is able to make these connections between a little bit of foreshadowing in the game versus what's going to come later on. Now, they don't have to be traditional maps or posters. They can be things that reveal information to the player as they go. So, for example, in Mortal Kombat, that screen starts with most of those boxes locked up, and as you go, there's a pleasure for the player to start to opening up these boxes and going, wow, I feel like I'm getting somewhere. I feel like I'm making progress because I can see how many that I've opened up and how many I have to go. And so this becomes a little bit more of an interactive map, right? It shows them, or like in Ghosts and Goblins, where the little Arthur character kind of moves along that crude little map showing, all right, here's the graveyard, and now we're in the city, and now we're in the catacombs. And as you go, you get this sense of progression, but you also, because of the way that it's laid out, you get a preview, right? So even if you're in the graveyard on the first level, you can look ahead and say, oh, what's that very strange pink building coming up, right? I wonder what's in there, and it piques your curiosity. Now, an element that taking from the map to the world are a device that Walt Disney invented is called a weenie. And a weenie is an object that is prominently placed in the world that attracts the player's eye, and it kind of whets their appetite for what's coming up in the rest of the environment. So when you go around Disneyland, you'll learn that or see that there are a lot of weenies to help guide the guest, the player, around the park. And this is very, very intentional. And so also it provides some very pretty pictures. So go online and look how many pictures there are of this Sleeping Beauty castle, right? It's a very popular thing to take a picture of. But it also is this moment where you can just kind of stop. And how often do we actually get to see a real castle in Southern California? So you can kind of stop and go, oh, that's pretty cool. It's pretty novel, right? So looking at how weenies work and guide the player around the world, so the major weenie in the park, of course, is the Disneyland Castle. It's in the hub. It's the central location of the park. And as the player moves down, or the guest moves down Main Street towards the castle, and if you remember in your trips to Disneyland, Main Street is just a straight shot. The castle is always there saying, come on, keep going, here's your first destination. When you reach the hub, which is the center of the park, you'll find that 3 new weenies are revealed to the player. And so as you kind of get past the buildings, you look and you go, oh, look, there's an entrance to Adventureland, and there's an entrance to Frontierland, and there's an entrance to Tomorrowland. These are some new objectives. So you can look and go, well, maybe I want to not go to the castle right now. Maybe I want to go to this space area over here. It's a lot more interesting to me. And then once you get past those thresholds, new weenies open up. So in Adventureland, it's Big Thunder Mountain, it's the Rivers of America. In Adventureland, it's the Tarzan Treehouse. In Fantasyland, it's the Monstro the Whale that's in the Storybook ride. It's the Matterhorn, and then it used to be the Astro Orbiter, but they've moved that to the front of the park. Now they've got the Orbitron, which still lives where the old rocket jets used to be, and Space Mountain. So as you're pulled through the world, and it keeps going and compounding, as you go, you're constantly being pulled by these new things to go, oh, what's that over there? Let me go see what this is. Oh, what's that over there? Until you finally essentially run out of space and hit the edge of the train, right? And in games, you can use the weenies not just as these navigation points and these points of interest, but you can use it for storytelling. So in God of War, we had a bit where Kratos comes into Athens, and Ares is there throwing fireballs down at the city. Now, we could have had the level have it where you're walking through and fireballs are exploding and people are running all over the place and there's chaos. But without this one shot with this weenie of Ares, you wouldn't get the context. You wouldn't understand what's going on in the level versus what's going on in the story. So you can use this as a way to tell some narrative, and particularly in areas where there's kind of big things going on. If you want to tell big stories or kind of convey scope, stopping and have kind of these moments where you look and go, wow, that's a really cool animation of this guy throwing fireballs. I'm going to stop and look at it for a second. Okay, I'm back into the action. Also, what you want to do, even though the weenies themselves are really useful navigation points, you can do other tricks to kind of draw the player's attention towards it. Because in a game, there's a lot more freedom of movement and freedom of camera, and it might be easy for the player to miss seeing these things. So you can do a lot of tricks to help draw the player's eye, right? Using getting the player up onto a higher elevation, and so they can get a better view, or directing their line of sight by using geometry. Just like in Disneyland, the weenie for the Sleeping Beauty Castle, all the other weenies are obscured by the buildings on Main Street. So if you could see past them, you'd have all these other distractions. But because Main Street is just high enough, you only have that central location to keep your focus on until we're ready to say, all right, now let's open up your field of view and look at all these other options. It's also good for backtracking because the player tends to get turned around when you backtrack in a 3D game. And so when they look at it and go, oh, I'm back at the Astrojets again, that must mean I'm at the front of Tomorrowland. If I turn myself this way, I remember there was Adventureland behind me. Oh, there it is. All right, I can start moving in that direction. Even if it's subconscious, it's still good for those bits of information to be there for the player. To address that point of getting turned around, I thought a really nice weenie was found in the Star Wars Force Unleashed game, where Starkiller was on his way to a tower that was blasting us like a force shield, I think, or a signal up to the outer space, and he had to go blow it up. And so when you first came across it, you would see this big tower with this energy kind of shooting up, and you're like, right, that's where I need to go. Now, over the course of the game, the path got very twisty, and so you'd kind of move around, and you'd kill stormtroopers, and you find some sub-objectives to bust open doors and kill the power source. And by the end of that level, I was kind of turned around, but fortunately that weenie was there, so I could turn and go, oh yeah, there's that tower with that big shaft of light, that's where I still need to go. So it's this really useful tool to help the player orient themselves, because in a game you want to have lots of interesting little experiences, right? You don't want it to just be, all right, let me just walk from one big thing to the next. So use those weenies to help support the rest of the world and the activities that are going on. Okay, so the path is very important as well. As much as the weenies. And in Disneyland, there's a very deliberate path for the player and the guests to travel upon. There's 3 different types. The first is a very obvious path, and this is the main route that you walk your way around the park. And if you look at the way even that the floor is tiled in Disneyland, generally smooth pathings are places that we want you to travel. So the next time you're in Disneyland, look at the way the floor is laid out, and anything that looks kind of like a nice smooth path, you're like, oh, I'm going to go this way, and it's going to lead me around and eventually get me to Critter Country, where I realize I've made a horrible mistake and I need to turn around and go back. But at this point, once you've gone to Disneyland once or a few times, you start realizing that there are all these neat little secret paths, right? There's little paths around the castle to get into Frontierland, and quick little, oh no, let's instead of going to the Matterhorn through the castle and around the Mad Tea Party into the Matterhorn, let's just take this little side path and we'll just cut by. And as a result, it makes you feel smarter, right? As a guest at Disneyland, you're like, oh, I really know my way around here, right? I know all these little shortcuts, so that way we're not spending so much time running around trying to figure out where we're going. We can just cut to the chase and get to the good stuff. Now, once a player has gotten, or a guest has gotten to this point, they might realize, oh man, I need to get from Main Street to Toontown. That's a really long way to go. So what we've provided, of course, is an expedient path. It's this path that's very quick, allows the guests to get from one place to another very fast, but there are less choices along the way. So with the regular path and with the secret paths, there's lots of little options for them to navigate their way around. The expedient path cuts it down. You only have 4 choices, right? You have the Main Street, you have New Orleans Station, you have Toontown, and you have Tomorrowland. And so that way you can think about your knowledge of the world that you already have, and you go, look, what's the fastest way to get to the Matterhorn? Is it faster for us to take the train around to Toontown and then backtrack, or is it faster for us to get off on Tomorrowland and go that way? And the answer is Tomorrowland. But that said, once again, it makes the player smart, but it also makes them realize, hey, there's lots of ways to get around, and a nice side effect is it allows you to kind of sit back and take in the whole world. And a game that does this really great, of course, is World of Warcraft, right? When you first start playing, you're slogging it around on foot, you're kind of down in everything, you're not quite sure where you need to go, everything's kind of a bit of a maze. But as you level up, you can, you go move faster, you can get a mount or something like that, and you take shortcuts, right? You kind of run over the mountaintops rather than, winding. You're like, oh, I know that cave I was looking for is just right over this mountain. I'm going to kind of, jump my way up the mountain to get back down to it. And then, of course, once you get to a higher level of knowledge and a higher level of experience, you have your winged mounts that you can then just kind of fly from point to point. And there's other systems, the train system and things like that. So there's all these ways that once you become more familiar with the world, it keeps you from getting bored with navigating, because now you're like, oh, I know the fastest way to get there. It makes you feel smarter as a player. And it saves you time, too. We don't want to waste your time. So also with another important thing to learn about paths is you can do some storytelling and some theming with just the way you lay out your path. So for example, Adventureland is based on a very, it's the sub-African continent, and it's, a densely populated town where all these bazaars are, and if you walk your way through Adventureland, it's this very narrow path, but with a lot of things going on. It's a very crowded feeling environment, but that's intentional because they wanted it to feel like this very crowded bazaar in Africa and that area. And there's really only 2 ways you can go through Adventureland, right? There's just, you go around either one of those planters, and that's it. But it gives you that feeling of, hey, look at all these things going on. There's all types of attractions calling my attention, all types of stores. Sometimes there's music out there or characters and that. And so it really captures that feeling of what it's like to be in this kind of bizarre environment. Now, Frontierland, on the other hand, is the Wild West, and the Wild West is the big expanse, right? It's the area that we're going to move into and all this great space. And so Frontierland does the same thing. It gives you this feeling of freedom, right? So when you enter the gate at Adventureland, you're actually met with a much wider path than you are in Adventure. You get to Frontierland, you're met with a wider path than you are in Adventureland. And you can walk down the middle, and the weenie is the Rivers of America, so there's really, once again, only one place to get to. But you can go this way, you can go that way, you can walk down the little wooden fronts of the stores and feel like a cowboy. There's a multitude of ways to go, and it gives you that illusion of, hey, I can go anywhere I want. Now, in reality, there's really only one place you can still go, and that's to the end of Frontierland. But it fosters that illusion of freedom of movement. Now, New Orleans Square, by comparison, is all about mystery and all about exploration. And the path, the regular path, if you look at Norland Square, most people will go, well, you're just going to go around it because all the good stuff, the Haunted Mansion and Splash Mountain, all the weenies, are calling me around the River of America. But what we want you to do as Imagineers is we want you to take your time and explore and kind of discover all the cool things. So we want you to go into this little back path, and we create a nice little beckoning environment. And when you get back there, you realize, hey, there's a lot of places that I can go. There's little stores and little restaurants, and each one of these X's represents some sort of experience that you can have, whether it's music or food or shopping experience or stuff like that. And so you really feel like you've discovered this little treasure, this little gem, that hidden within it are all these neat little things to find. And then, of course, we also make it a little interesting on the way out. We give you lots of multiple paths to explore, so that way you spend a little time in there and you kind of eventually meander your way out, and you're like, oh yeah, back to the Haunted Mansion, back to Splash Mountain. So another important tool to use when you're building your paths is lighting. And lighting, Disneyland uses lighting maybe better than just about any place I know on Earth. They're very clever. The Imagineers are always thinking about all aspects, sound and textures and smells, but lighting is a special tool that we have at our control. And in your game level, of course, you want to use lighting to guide the player along. And so let me show you just a real clever trick that happens at Disneyland. Is if you're in the park and you're in the park during the fireworks, and once the fireworks are over, Disneyland's message to the guest is, okay, the day's over, the fireworks are done, please leave. And what happens is they leave the lights low in Main Street, because this is the area where most people congregate to watch the fireworks. And they leave the castle on because we still want you to have that weenie. We still want you to have that navigation point because we're still open a few more hours in the evening, right? But what we do instead is we turn on all the lights on Main Street. And our message to you is, okay, please leave. This is where you want to go. People are drawn towards light, right? If they see absence of light, they will avoid it. But if they see a lot of light, they will say, oh, this is where I need to go. I need to leave now. And the same thing happens in games, right? How many of you are familiar with the Squint Test that the Naughty Dog guys do, right? Which is, look at this image of Crash Bandicoot. Now squint your eyes down. And what's the brightest thing that you see on that screen? How'd you say the apple? Smart Alec. All right, now what you see, well, other than the mango, is the path, right? Because the designer wants you to go that way. Now, granted, it's a linear path, and there isn't anywhere to go, but they've used this idea moving forward into more complex things. So even in Uncharted, which gives you a greater range of freedom of movement, they have lit the path in a way that it's still the brightest thing on the screen. So make sure that the player knows where they have to go. There's nothing worse than being in a game, getting to a point and going, I have no idea where to go next. Nothing is guiding me there, and light is a really great way to help guide the player along, and relatively easy to get into the game. All right, so the levels themselves, you're thinking about level design, and you're thinking about what you want the player to be doing during these levels. And based on the level design or the experiences at Disneyland, I think that there's 4 goals for the player that map very well into video games. The first is the escape survive, and that's kind of this is what most video game levels are. They're, get out alive, don't get killed by ghosts, don't get blown up by the Death Star, things like that. The second one is exploration. Find these more in, Zelda games and things like that, where you're given this beautiful big world and you're trying to just explore it and enjoy it. And there's lots of activities for you to do, like Tom Sawyer's Island or even Tarzan's Treehouse, even though it's a single linear path. There's still lots of little stops along the way that you can make and discover. You'd never know any of that stuff existed unless you took the time to climb the tree. Now, another area that we don't do as well in video games is education. And you can still educate a player about things under the disguise of level design. So, for example, one of my favorite ones is in The Force Unleashed, where the character is in the TIE Fighter factory. And the TIE Fighter factory, it answers this question that maybe nobody ever thought to ask, which was, how are TIE Fighters made, right? And so this whole level teaches you how TIE Fighters are made, even though it has no bearing on the game. It's just making this very interesting environment. And when you come out of it, you have a little bit of a greater understanding. Now, the last one is the moral lesson. We talked a little bit about that. And these are the attractions that have, like I said, they were directly translated in from the animated feature that they're based on. So with Mr. Toad, it's, don't drive fast or you'll go to hell. Pinocchio's is don't get into trouble, don't skip school, you'll get into trouble. And in Pirates of the Caribbean is dead men tell no tale, right? And I thought about this and I was like, well, is this really valid? Is this a really, am I saying something outrageous here? And, it shows up in games, right? And I'm not just talking about you're at the end of the game, are you good or bad? But these are choices along the way that kind of influence the level design as much as the gameplay that's found in them. So, for example, my example of the Pirates of the Caribbean, we're going to not be talking about the Johnny Depp version because it throws a little bit of a monkey wrench into it. But we'll be talking about the classic version. So, structuring the Pirates of the Caribbean as if it were an escape, explore type story, Walt Disney, when he would talk about the Pirates of the Caribbean, said, you go over the waterfall into the time of the pirates. And then you go through some caves and you discover the pirates were there and they found this treasure and they're all dead. And then you move out into the city and the city is being attacked by the pirates. And then you escape the burning city and you go back up the waterfall and yay, we've escaped, we survived, right? And that's like a typical video game level, right? You go through the pirates, they try to kill you, yay, I'm done with the level, move on. But really I maintain that the story is more of a moral one. So when you're about to go over that waterfall, there's a skull, and the skull says, dead men tell no tales, right? And in the original version of the attraction, there was a voiceover that was cut because unfortunately it was too long and people weren't hearing all of it as the boat went through. But it would tell these little vignettes about the dead pirates. And so one of them would say, oh, I lusted after gold and this is where it got me. And it was the guy on the big pile of treasure. Or I lusted after women and drink and this is where it got me. And then a voice would cut in and say, dead men tell no tales. Which essentially was like, shut up, let them learn on their own, right? And so then you'd get into the city and you'd see the pirates actively engaging in these acts of piracy, right? And the second half of the living pirate section is showing the wages of their sin, right? This is what happens to you when you loot and sack and chase women around. You end up in the mud with the pigs, and you end up in jail, and you end up in these situations where you're shooting at each other, and eventually those pirates are going to blow each other up, right? And as you go back up the waterfall, once again the voice kicks in and says, dead men tell no tales. Or another way of saying it is, there but for the grace of God go I, right? Is that you don't engage in piracy. Now, granted, it's a. How many of you guys are going to run out and become pirates once you've ridden? Yeah, exactly. And me too, when I was going to go. But not very many of us are going to run out and become pirates when we grow up, right? But it was saying, look, we're trying to tell you a moral story that these pirates were not good guys, even though it might look like we're making them look, cool. They really were bad guys, right? And the reason why I maintain that this is the ultimate goal for the Pirates of the Caribbean is when we had a chance to actually redo the attraction from start in Paris, because Florida was let's just rebuild. Walt has passed away. Let's rebuild what we have in Disneyland. But when we got to Euro Disney, we had this opportunity to say, let's rebuild this attraction from the ground up. And I don't know, have any of you been on the Pirates in Euro Disneyland? It's actually a radically different attraction than it is in Japan and in Florida and in Anaheim. And so the way the story is told there is you actually go up a waterfall and you hear the dead men tell no tales, and then you see the act of piracy, and then you see the wages of sin, and then you see that they've all died, these horrible deaths, and then you go back down and out you go, and that's the end of the attraction. And so it really rams home this story of this is a moral lesson for you to take away with you. And once again, a game that does this is Bioshock, where Bioshock has for example, the opening level or the early level of the medical center. And you go into the medical center, and as you go, you hear these audio tapes, and you hear testimonials of people saying, oh, I wanted to look more beautiful, I wanted to be perfect, and you realize that, well, what's really going on is in these people's vain attempts to become perfect humans, they're turning themselves into monsters. And by the end of the experience, when you finally get to the doctor, it's this horror show, right? There's bodies all over the place, and it's this moral story of like, don't tamper with nature, right? That's the moral story of this section of Bioshock is, what's the ramifications of doing these things, right? Nothing good is going to come about of this. All right, so let's slow down a little bit and wander our way back to Main Street. And a lot of people think that Main Street is boring, but I argue it isn't, because it serves some very important things. The first is it tells the backstory of Walt Disney. This is his childhood. This is where he came from. And at the time, in 1955, when the park opened, this was the history of a lot of the guests as well, right? This was meant to resonate with the parents or the grandparents that were bringing the kids to Disneyland for them to go, yeah, this is what it was like when I grew up, right? Look, there were gas lamps and there were these old, horse-drawn carriages, and I remember going to the theater when it was a nickel, and you had to put up with all these stories from Grandpa. But it was this way of nostalgia of Walt saying, this is where I came from. Now we're going to go to where I eventually went from. Now, it does make you wonder, what if Disneyland were rebuilt today from the ground up? Would this be like the 80s? Would it be like Back to the Future 2 or something? It'd be pretty awesome, actually. All right, so some lessons from Main Street. The first is that not every ride has to be an e-ticket. And an e-ticket is Disney terminology for the best, the most expensive, the most thrilling of the attractions. But Main Street has just some nice, quiet things that you can kind of motor around in and get you from here to there. And Lego Batman, for example, they do the same thing, right? You find these little motorcycles you can hop on. You just drive around like an idiot. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't advance the story. But it's nice that it's there. The second one is that there's always a place to sit, right? There's frequent checkpoints. And from personal experience, I cannot stress this enough, checkpoints are your friend, right? Whether you're doing it as a preloaded autosave, or it's a visible place that you go and check, or look at the structure of Angry Birds, right? I mean, each one of those level breaks essentially is a checkpoint, a moment where you kind of stop and go, you know what? I'm done waiting in line. I'm at the ATM. I can go get my money now. I'll come back to the game later. I have this little stopping point. Just make sure you build in frequent stopping points into your gameplay. Be kind to the player, let them rest. In Final Fantasy, now I think that's, 9 or 8, or that's a really close slide. But essentially, there's this neat little mini game where you're kind of running your way to the opera house, and there's some kids playing jump rope. And you can stop and just kind of watch them and talk to the kids, and eventually they invite you to come in and jump. And it's much like the motorcycle that's in Lego, but it's this nice little distraction that means nothing to the experience until later on the kids, I think, show up and they can help you in some way. But it's just this nice little moment where you can just kind of stop and enjoy the ambiance of the world. So it's something that fits in. I would totally expect to see kids playing jump rope in a city, but it's just a nice little place to stop and listen. You can do this with music. You can do this with mini games. Stop and some of the games that you can pull one-arm bandits when you're in a Vegas level or something like that. These cute little distractions. And then finally, we talked a little bit about reorientation, but what's most important about the hub, which is, of course, the main weenie, right, is at the top of the hub, is it's this place of safety. And I don't know about you, but every time I'm in Disneyland and I kind of listen in on the guests and what they're saying, once in a while I'll hear parents go, all right, if we ever get separated, now granted in the age of mobile phones this is less of a case, but when I was a kid, back in the old days, the hub was a place you would go to meet, right? If we ever get lost, meet in front of the castle, meet in front of the hub, right? This is where we'll meet. And so people feel safe to go back to this spot. Of course, Main Street has lots of nook and crannies. And I always say that even at the end of any alley, you should always have a trash can, whether there's a cat or a zombie or whatever in it is a treasure in it, it's totally up to you. But creating little fingers, little distractions, even if you have a completely linear path, like Main Street, it's just this straight shot, but there's still these tiny little fingers that you can wander down and go, oh, what's over here? Oh, there's a funny sound effect. Oh, what's over here? There's a neat piece of art. Never underestimate the importance of those fingers making your world feel even more like a real place. And you can hide cool stuff in there as well. All right, speaking of hiding stuff, a really good utilization of this is on Pirate's Lair. Now, Tom Sawyer's Island got a refit in the early 2000s and made it all pirate themed, but there's still some cool stuff in it. So, for example, on Pirate's Lair is Tom Sawyer's Island, which is Tom Sawyer's Treehouse. And Tom Sawyer's Treehouse is this place where kids can go and run and climb and all that. And one time my kids were there, and they came running back down. They're like, Dad, we've got to go find the treasure. I'm like, what the heck are you talking about? What treasure? And they're like, oh, inside Tom Sawyer's Treehouse, there's this map. And so I fit myself and kind of squeezed through and got up to the map and looked and went, oh yeah, son of a gun, there's a treasure map up here. All right, let's go find the treasure. And so we looked at using the map, kind of looking and going, all right, it's all the way back here somewhere. We meandered our way, and sure enough, we found essentially the X marks the spot, and we were rewarded with this nice pile of fake treasure. And we would have never known about this spot because it's kind of off the beaten path, and it wasn't particularly at the end of a directed trail. You had to you wouldn't have stumbled on it very easily, but because this treasure map in the house pointed it to us, it became a destination. And so it was this nice reward. We were rewarded for the fact that we took the time to look for this. Another way they do that is if you can enlist some small children to be your slaves, you can have them push this, and there's a treasure chest suspended by these cables. And not only do you get the treasure, but you get the surprise of the pirate saying, "Give me back my treasure," right? So sometimes the rewards don't have to be monetary or a new sword or something to advance the gameplay. It can just be something fun. All right, well, when you're thinking about your level, you want to think about what lives in your level. And Disneyland does a great job of populating their levels. So, for example, if I say Western Town, well, all the things that you would expect to find in a Western town, like a water, horse trough and a wagon and a wooden Indian and even those old video game standbys, crates and barrels, can all be found in this level, right? Or in this environment. But what's nice about Disney is not only do we do what's expected, but we turn it on its head. So in Toontown, which is one of the other lands, we have the same things that you would find in a place like Frontierland. So we still have the water fountains, and we still have the wagons, and we still even have the crates and barrels, right? But they're done themed to this environment. So when you're building your level, obviously a good exercise is to go, okay, what kind of place am I making? And then make a big list of all the things you would expect to find, and then start turning them into gameplay, right? Because in Toontown, for example, those crates, they're not just there for decoration. If you pull them open, they make funny sounds. Or if you push on the plunger in front of the dynamite factory, if you get, whatever the X number of times it takes to plunge it, you'll get rewarded with a crackle of fireworks and a little light show and stuff like that. So it's not just important to have these things in the world to help make it feel like a real place, but giving them some sort of level of function as well, or to surprise the player are really good. And of course, reusing assets, right, is very important. It's something that we as video game developers have mastered. We're really good at taking a generic object and reusing it over and over again, right? Think about power-ups, think about breakable crates or exploding barrels. But Disneyland came up with it first, man. We had our generic trash can, and did you know that trash can was designed by Walt Disney himself? He actually, trash cans up until that point had open tops. And he's like, I don't want a park with trash just out in the open. So he designed this top to it, and that's where we get the closed top trash can. It's from Walt Disney himself. And of course, you can look at these trash cans and figure out what land you're in. So they become they become like this mini weenie, like a cocktail weenie, that you can look at and go, oh yeah, the trash can looks like jungle stuff. I must be in Adventureland, even if your nose is down in your device. But hopefully you're not doing that when you're at Disneyland, all right? Okay, another storytelling technique you can do with your level is what I call illusional narrative. And this is storytelling, economic storytelling. And so a really good example of this is found in the Peter Pan flight attraction, which is in it, you're in a pirate ship, you're flying over Neverland, you're flying over London, and you eventually get to a point where Peter Pan is fighting Captain Hook. And the path of the vehicle goes like this. It travels over the bow of the ship and then back around the ship and then out. And what's really cool is they tell this very short story within this very compact bit of space. So as you first approach, you see Peter Pan fighting Captain Hook, and as you literally go around the corner and go around the sail, you see the second half of the story. You see Peter Pan standing at the back of the ship. He's won. Everybody's happy. Wendy is free. The Lost Boys are free. They're no longer tied up. And you see Captain Hook standing on the crocodile, and it's showing this cause and effect, but there's not, like, nobody's moving, like nobody had to move, they just used two statues. They just did it merely by the fact of knowing where the player was going to be and setting up this situation to make sure that you're looking at the right thing, right? And so, of course, you have to be careful when you're setting up these scenarios because backtracking might screw it up. How many of you guys seen the YouTube video of the Watson that follows you around, right, in the Sherlock Holmes game? Go look for that one. It's really funny, right? But that's an example of somebody not thinking about their scripting the character to do what they needed to do. They obviously didn't test it enough or something, or just nobody cared, I guess. But the way that you can do it in games, right, is like in Medal of Honor. It's pretty dark, but there's a sergeant there, and he says, all right, soldier, we're going to go in, and we're going to smash those Nazis. We're going to go into this house and get them all. I'll meet you on the other side. Go get them. Hoo-ah. and you go through and you shoot Nazis and you have a good time. And then when you get to the back, he's standing there at the exit and he's like, good job, we killed those Nazis, right on, let's keep going. And if you were to pull that map up and look at a top view, there's a little dude standing at the front door and there's another dude standing at the back door, right? And they didn't animate anything, they didn't have a motion path, they didn't have to animate any walk cycle, any of those time-consuming things. They just put two guys in there with just enough animation to sell the idea that the sergeant was at the beginning and at the end. And so these are really good tricks that way you know the animation is time intensive and voiceover, it takes time. You got to write that stuff and have them recorded. And so be smart. Use wherever you can get away with using things efficiently, go ahead and do that. All right, another thing you can do to help your level along is to add danger. Now, Disneyland is all about cheating death, right? Most of our attractions are about putting you in some sort of dangerous scenario and then having you survive it in some capacity. And just like at Disneyland, and just like when people ride roller coasters, they want to feel like they're in danger, but in reality, they know they're safe, right? And so if you set up these environments that look like they're trouble, so narrow bridges work really well, right? As people kind of have to walk their way across them, or environments with fires going on, or some other natural disaster, or some other siege going on, or skeletons, right? If you lay skeletons in a sign that says "Keep out," you'll get eaten by a dragon. People are going to be like, "All right, well, I'm going to be a little more careful here because something bad is going to happen, and I've got to be careful." And people like that little thrill that they get for feeling like they might be in danger, even if they aren't. By the way, a quick question. Anyone know how many Disneyland attractions feature skeletons or skulls? I will answer that one later. Anyway, so a really good example is the Lord of the Rings Two Towers, where you start the game and you're in the middle of this huge war and there's lava pouring and there's arrows flying through the air and orcs are screaming and yelling. But if you think about the game and if you stop and put down your controller, you're really only fighting one or two orcs. It's the fact that they made this whole world so engaging and so active and so lively and feel like you're in danger, but in reality you're just doing some basic training, right? And so whatever you can do to kind of heighten the excitement and heighten the tension will grab your players' attention. All right, now we're in the home stretch. So we're going to look at one attraction in particular, the Indiana Jones Temple of the Forbidden Eye. And the brilliance of this attraction isn't even the attraction itself, it's its line. The line is so awesome, it uses every single trick that I just talked about in it to create a very compelling experience even before you go on the ride. So apologize for anyone who's not been on this attraction. I highly recommend it. So, just like we were talking about with the danger, right? It does foreshadowing. It has statues of snakes all over the place, and skulls carvings, and danger signs. And so as you're moving through the queue, people are going, oh, there's going to be something bad here, and it involves snakes. And I don't know what exactly it is, but it's going to be trouble. And so I don't know if any of you guys have ever attended like a haunted house, in someone's garage or something they do at a shopping mall. Like the anticipation of waiting in line before you get into the haunted house sometimes freaks people out more than when they actually get into the haunted house, right? And so you want to use that to your advantage. When you're building your levels, if you're going to build something scary, you don't just throw them right into it, right? You build up to it. You let them get scared first. It's even better if you tell them that something scary is going to happen, right? If you want some really good examples of how to set up these kind of levels, play any of the Dead Space game. Well, not the Extraction, but play the main two Dead Space games, right? Because they do a great job of kind of building tension and having little false scares that get you going until you get to the big ones. Another thing that the Indiana Jones queue does really well is it uses its space, right? It uses elevation. You kind of go back and forth. There's misdirection. You think you're going to be going into the temple, and then the line moves back. And so that way you're like, oh, I really want to get into that temple. No, I got to turn around and keep going this way. Oh, now I'm going to get it. No, I'm not going. Oh, all right. Hey, now we're going up the path. And that's another cool psychological thing that you can use when you're building your level is elevation, right? If you go up, people feel like they're getting somewhere. If they go down, they feel like they're going into danger, into suspense. So even think about the way the player is moving up or down will help tell part of your story and get them into the right mood. Of course, the Indiana Jones attraction has its share of weenies. As you make your way through, you look and you see the Tarzan treehouse and you see the Jungle Cruise, and you're like, oh, those are really cool places, right? I want to go to these, and maybe when we're done with this attraction, we can go to this next one. Now, there's storytelling, of course, all through the environment, because when we build our experiences at Disneyland, it's all about story first, so we have to have a very compelling story. And this one, of course, we know Indiana Jones, and we know, or at least we're familiar with it, but maybe to people that don't know Indiana Jones, we need to educate them a little bit and let them know the kind of environments that Indy goes into with these traps and these Indian gods, and you can see this plinth with the snake wrapping the guy up, because bad things are going to happen. And another cool thing is we originally had a puzzle in the queue of the Indiana Jones attraction. We had Marlesh, the language of Mara, and we used to hand out Decoder Cards. And so when you were waiting, and it was a long wait back in the opening day when the attraction first opened, you had this Decoder Card. So as you're standing there going, oh man, I'm bored, I'm waiting in line, oh hey, I'll try and decode this and see what it says. And it usually would say stuff like, beware of the eye of Mara, or watch out for snakes, or make AT&T your service provider, or something like that. Of course, there's our friends, the skulls, right, and spikes, but we're also talking, we're implying not only the danger, but we're having it be interactive, right? So I don't know, any of you guys know that if you tug on the pole, the one that's kind of bent over there, do you know that the roof comes down with the spikes on it? And then there's also a rope that if you pull on it, you can hear a little archaeologist moan as all his artifacts break and stuff like that. So there's these fun little things that, kind of like the rope skipping game, right? It doesn't need to be there. We didn't need to build these things in, but they're fun. And so why not? Why not have them in there? Oh, also check out the skull head implied in the Batcave, right? You can see the lights being the eyes, and it kind of makes this skull. And you only see it for a brief second, but it gets you into the mood of I'm moving into danger. Now, what's really cool about the Indiana Jones attraction is we have a tutorial level, right? We have a chamber where you go in there, and Sala, Indy's pal from the movies, says, look, I've invented this wonderful car, and it uses seatbelts, because remember, it's 1934, and there's no seatbelts back then. And so the audience is also part of it. They're also in 1934, so we have to teach them. And what we're really teaching you is how to be safe and use the seatbelt and get on quickly, so then we can get the cart moving and you can get off on your adventure. There's also maps. If you go around after you get through the Sala room, if you turn around, there's an actual whole map of the attraction that shows all the dangers are and things like that. It's something no one ever sees because they're too busy concentrating. But if you stop and look, these details are there to be found. And then, of course, we're building your anticipation, right? We want to get to the attraction. You go, look, I'm almost there. I see the carts are right in sight. But no, we have to make you go up some stairs and across this top and down some other stairs. So by the time you're at the car itself, you're like, I cannot wait to, this is going to be the most awesome experience. And, of course, it is. All right, and then, of course, when you're building your levels, you want to think about interior and exterior spaces, juxtaposing these two, because if you're just going hall, 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 after a while, it's going to feel repetitive. But if you go hall, big room, hall, medium-sized room, hall, big room, it's going to give a better sense of place. If you can try and make it feel like these rooms have purpose, that's even better, and that the little paths are connecting tissue. But it also makes a place feel natural, right? A completely symmetrical environment just doesn't feel natural to the player. And it gets repetitive, right? And then, of course, they use illusional narrative, right? Indiana Jones hanging from the rope. Come on, Indy, come down. And then you literally go down a hill and around a corner. And there he is again, safe and sound. Hey, we won. We didn't get squished by a giant ball. By the way, that giant ball weighs like 8 tons, and you can hear it roll outside of the building. So like every 5 minutes you hear this rumble of the giant ball rolling. It's pretty impressive and a little terrifying. All right, so we're done. We've won. We've escaped the Eye of Mara, and we're on our way out. And so the message that's being given to the player is, you're safe. You've escaped. Congratulations. So there's no scary imagery. There are no snakes. There are no skulls on spikes. It's a nice, clearly lit path. All right, squint your eyes and look at that bottom image. What do you see? See the path, right? My favorite one is this just nice row of lights that's saying, go out this way, follow the lights, out you go, right? Thanks for coming. And so in summary, you want to think of all these elements that Disneyland has used to build their level designs, which is, just think about the story and your interests and, what do you want the player to do, and design your way down. Think about the world first and work your way down to the experiences. Use the environment to tell the story. Think about the objects they're going to find, using tricks like the pathing techniques with the lighting and the illusional narrative. Train the player by having them do things rather than just experience or look at them. Encourage the player movement, right? You can use those maps and posters. You want to use weenies to help guide them around. And then you want to maximize the emotions, right? You want to make them feel safe or in danger, depending on what you want. Foreshadow all your cool stuff. Use those skeletons, right? Oh, by the way, how many skeletons? Answer is 12. There are at least 12 dead bodies of some sort in Disneyland. Actually, there's 1,994 skulls in that Indiana Jones room to commemorate the year that the attraction was open. And there's one real skeleton in the Pirates of the Caribbean. And if you talk to me afterwards, I'll tell you where it is. All right. Also, if you like this talk, I wrote a couple of books about game design. Pluggity plug. They can be bought on Amazon.com. Level Up is all about game design. Swipe This is a new one that just came out about touchscreen game design, which is very different than regular game design, as I'm sure many of you know. So if you like books, you like pictures, and you like chili recipes, I highly recommend these books. All right, so I'm done. You can visit me on the interweb. You can email me. Thank you very much for coming. Oh, I almost forgot. I have to take a picture of you guys to prove that you were actually here. So, everyone smile. Ready? Say cheese. Oh, hang on a second. You blinked. Hold on one more time. All right, ready? Say cheese. There we go. Thank you very much. And thanks for coming. Any questions? Where's the real skeleton? Oh, all right. Well, it is technically after. All right, fair enough. It is the skull head mounted to the bedboard of the pirate captain in the Pirates of the Caribbean. That is, I believe, the last real skull in the park. They used to be all real, and then I think it became illegal. Because we kept killing people to put them in, they kept falling apart, they smell bad. Anyone else? Anyone ready to go? Yes, all the way in the back.
Oh, sorry. Hi.
Hi.
So in Indiana Jones and a lot of attractions at Disneyland, the adults probably already have an idea in their mind of
right, they know
the
the
narrative.
stories.
So what are some design things that you've done as examples to make sure even like the kids, have fun? And I mean, you've given some examples, but I'm just curious, did you ever have any specific thought processes about your level designs in these attractions to make sure that everyone had a good time?
To teach them about the character and the stories, or? Well, in the case of the Indiana Jones attraction, think of it this way, right? You see this name. It says Indiana Jones and the Temple of the Forbidden Eye, right? So you know that there's a dude named Indiana Jones, and there's a Temple of Forbidden Eye, right? And so if you walk up and you go, well, here's this temple. I know that this is a temple, and you start learning about the temple because that's the part you don't know about, right? You might already know who Indiana Jones is, but you don't know what this Forbidden Eye is. So that's the most important thing for us first to teach you. But we have to take into account that you don't know who Indiana Jones is. So as you go through the attraction, particularly once you get to the rotunda where the archaeological dig is going on, and more importantly, Sala's tutorial, and there's some other elements. There's an office, actually, like a dig office. That's where we start teaching you a little bit about Indiana Jones. So if you watch the cycle, and usually, unless it's a pretty light day, you see at least one cycle of the training video, it always says famed archaeologist Indiana Jones and shows a little picture. And now because Harrison Ford didn't actually film anything for the attraction, we have this standing guy kind of pulling his hat down and running in, right? But it shows you who this Indiana Jones dude is. He wears a fedora, he's got this bomber jacket on, and as you go past the dig office, you see another fedora in there, and there are the cast members are dressed similarly to Indiana Jones. They've got the fedora and the kind of the buff colored clothing. So we're trying to teach you a little bit of the fiction of the thing that you might not know going in. And then, of course, when you get to the gates of doom, where Indy is kind of holding the door back and going, oh, you looked at the temple. And when you see it, you kind of go, okay, well, based on what I've seen in the video and what I've seen as I've worked my way around, that must be Indiana Jones, right? And so we build the story in these little bits. We spool it out and give you little bits of information. And an interesting thing about the attractions in general is the attractions used to be more designed from a first-person player point of view. So in Fantasyland, if any of you guys are old enough to remember before they changed Fantasyland over in the early 80s, the attractions, Mr. Toad and Snow White and Peter Pan and Alice, didn't have the main characters in the attraction. And the reason for that was the designers of the attraction wanted it to be you being those characters. So it's not Peter Pan flying, it's Peter Pan's possessive flight. It's Snow White's scary adventure. And so you are cast as Snow White or as Peter Pan, and you're experiencing this from their point of view. Now, the irony is, over the years, guests would say, well, where's Peter Pan? He's not in the ride. Where's Snow White? She's not in the ride. And instead of having to go through all this rigmarole of explaining to them, hey, you are supposed to be Peter Pan, we just added figures in. So it's something to consider as well with your storytelling, right? Make sure that you're providing the right information. Otherwise, you're just going to make them a little confused.
Great, that's all we have time for, but I'm sure you can come up afterwards and ask questions because there's a break right now.
Oh, excellent. And if any of you guys have your copies of your books, I'll be happy to sign those as well, if you brought them. Thank you again.